The Game Week Podcast, powered by Keros. Welcome to episode 2 of the Game Week Podcast, powered by Keros, the number one solution for maximising preparation and performance in elite sport. I'm your host, Andrew Trimble, and every week we'll be taking a deep dive behind the scenes of the elite sports world as we chat to key stakeholders in high-performance environments about their stories and how they manage their game week. Okay, Ben's best known as a Rugby Sevens legend for England. He's been capped 70 times and scored an incredible world record, 2,652 points along the way. Ben's also played 15s, playing in the English Premiership as well as Australia, New Zealand and Japan. Since retiring, he's moved across the globe to take on various coaching and ambassadorial roles in Sri Lanka, America and Australia, as well as starting a new career in finance. Now, Ben works and lives in Queensland, Australia, but also provides advice to the Singapore National Rugby Union, developing the game in Southeast Asia. Ben, you sound busy. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Andrew. Thanks very much for having me on. Yes, it's been an interesting time.
Yes, it's crazy times at the minute. I'm a big fan, so we're delighted to have you on the show to talk a little bit of high performance. Let's start with a pretty high level intro. Why do you do what you do, and why are you passionate about it?
I think for me, obviously the passion came through on playing, and then post playing, I always wanted to be involved in the game, and I've always liked working with people and trying to get the best out of people. And so really that's been a catalyst for me, and it's taken a few different forms, but ultimately at the core it's working with teams, it's working with individuals, and looking to support them more than anything else. Not about telling them how to do something other than being there to actually support them and keep them thinking. I had someone do it with me, and I found it really valuable, especially from a coaching space.
Yeah, your experience in sevens is obviously what you're most known for, and that contrast in mindsets and atmosphere and culture, I suppose, in a sevens environment to a 15s environment, I think is quite interesting. So we'll get into that at some stage. But where do you see the future with the sevens game? Do you see it progressing and running alongside 15s, or with the Olympic exposure, where do you see the kind of long-term vision for the game for the sevens?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. And for me, if I answer it from a personal perspective, what I'd like to see is it have the same kind of flavour that it did when we were playing, which was that ability to work alongside it quite closely. I think sevens created a fantastic platform for finding players and providing that pressured environment that you need when you go into the 15s environment, especially into the test environment within the 15s game. And so I think with the Olympics, things did change slightly, and there was a shift, and it was kind of going on its own focus for a little while. But I think both of them working in line together is the best way for both codes to really work and develop the game. And I feel even in developing countries where that's ultimately important, sevens is the game that's going to help drive 15s as well. And so that's where my belief lies, and I'd love to see that in the future.
Do you see sevens almost as an intro to the 15s game, or do they sit separately? Or, is it potentially a developing country that hasn't got that much exposure to the 15s game? Is it more accessible to get into sevens and then kind of take their rugby story from there?
Yeah, I think if we take that from the developing countries perspective, I think it's a great way to start, because it's probably slightly less technical, and you still got the array of players, which is the beauty of rugby. But 15s is quite technical when we start looking at the scrum and the techniques of the front row and the line out lifting, etc. Whereas there's a bit more adaptability within the sevens game, and I think at the core it teaches you the really good skill levels that you can then take into 15s, and I think that's where the developing countries can really progress. And as the game attracts numbers, they can build that out into 10s, 13s, 15s. At the developed nations level, I think, there's obviously the point whereby it does provide a platform for certain players that aren't suited to the 15s game to apply a trade in rugby. Outside of that, though, I feel like there's the opportunity for a lot of players to dip in and out. Certainly from my own perspective, I really enjoyed the two and the way that they worked within my career. I kind of got refreshed playing sevens after having a bit of a slog with 15s for a while, and then I came back to 15s and I felt really refreshed and I was ready to go and try new things. And then after a month or so of 15s, I then got that opportunity to go back to sevens and again have that opportunity just to express for that little bit more space. And I think for certain players that balance would be something that's really nice to have.
So do you think they effectively, what you're suggesting or arguing is that they can complement each other rather than being specialist, and you find this in young people growing up playing a variety of different sports. You can see the rugby guys in Ireland who've played GA growing up because they have a different skill set or an additional skill set. Could that be the case then for guys getting a little bit of exposure in sevens to one skill set and then just developing something else in 15s and then just becoming a more rounded player?
I think so, yeah. And it'd be interesting to see where 15s is going as well. Obviously, there's a lot being talked about in the game and the tackles coming into play a little bit. But where does that take the 15s game? And I'm quite keen to see the 15s game open up. I think people like to see people running, beating people, and defense has got really strong and obviously hard to break down. It'd be great to see that attack open up, and sevens is a game that can support that because it's, that's what it's about. It's about those one-on-ones. It's about taking your opportunities. And so I think there could start to be a lot of linkage and crossover. And, in terms of the athleticism, that's in abundance in both sides. And so the skill crossover, I think, is perfect for both games. And ultimately in sevens, the beauty is your skills get honed because you do get to just have hands on the ball so much more than you would necessarily in a game of 15s.
Yeah, it seems like in 15s, defense has been on top for a number of years now, and continually people are critical of the style of rugby that winning teams are producing, and potentially it's not that accessible to people approaching rugby 15s for the first time. They might think this is just physical. This is just a battle. This is just collisions, and that's obviously what we're trying to get away with to make it more entertaining, but also to make it more safe with everything that's going on with concussions at the minute. Are we missing something? Or is there something obvious that we can address to make that step towards the style of rugby that we want to see in 15s?
I think it's starting to happen, but I think, for me, it's probably the way in which it's coached, and that's definitely not a direct dig at coaches themselves, because different types of leagues create different types of coaching style and play within competitions. The Super Rugby's always been a bit more open. There's been no promotion relegation, so you can have a bit more of a crack because there's not so much pressure on, whereas in the English Premiership and in European rugby, that's a slightly different flavour, and it's a war of attrition and points are key, so the games are played slightly differently. But I think at the core, the ability to allow players to use their qualities and their skills as to why they got there in the first place and really allow them to express those on the field, I think we'd start to see a little bit more of a game change. It is about taking risk, but if players are comfortable taking that risk, it will open games up, and seeing people start to move the ball from their try lines, it's going to change the way people think in defence now and not become so predictable. And I think that's probably, where the game where early on went, I felt quite structured. Whereas if we can really open that up and give players the opportunities to create that on the field, I think we'll start to see a shift. And it's something that New Zealand obviously have been doing well for a long, long time. And I guess that's culturally within their play, and it's changing that mindset within other areas, because I don't think it's a difference with the type of athlete and the skill level. I think that's in abundance across the board.
That's the conclusion that people come to, isn't it? We in Ireland, we just don't have the athletes to be able to do that, or in England we don't have the athletes to do that, and or the weather conditions. It has to be more than that. It has to be a mindset. It has to be a philosophy. How did you find that whenever you made the crossover you've got actually a really lovely blend of experience to sevens, 15s, different teams, different leagues, different weather conditions, different philosophies. How did you find that playing in Australia, or your exposure to New Zealand rugby, Japan? How did that? How did they complement each other, or was there kind of like a culture shock every time you transitioned into something new?
I think the one biggest difference I noticed when I first came to the Southern Hemisphere, for me in particular, was I think coming into from the English Premiership, we were quite critical of all of our areas of performance, and often there was, I felt, and maybe it's just a personal thing, there was a lot of focus on the negatives you'd done, and I had this kind of shift when I moved over that there wasn't that shift. A lot of people talked about the positives, and then I'd be constantly going, yeah, but I dropped that ball there, or my pass wasn't as good as it could have been there, but they were really like, well, but a try came from that, or a try came from, and it kind of started to shift the way I looked at it. And I thought it was quite good because it was more of a positive reinforcement of the things you were doing well, and not having to focus. You know what you've done wrong most of the time, so you don't need to be told, if that makes sense.
It's obvious, isn't it? It's always obvious. Yeah, it doesn't need to be
I don't know
pointed
why.
out.
It doesn't. It's like, if you've had a howler, and I don't know why that may have been apparent, but it's something I did notice. But then I think the openness, and certainly there was a big emphasis on attack when I moved, especially when I played in New Zealand. I had a fantastic time in Nelson there at Tasman Marcos, and narrowly missed out with an opportunity with the Crusaders. It was defence was defence, but we spent a lot of time working on our attack, and just the ability to shift the ball and be connected, and openness, and are willing to try. And there wasn't really, if you did try something, it wasn't frowned upon. It was left to the player to make that decision, which I enjoyed. And then moving to Japan was a completely different system, very very much a culture that is very protocolized, and so you'd fit into this patterned way of life. To be honest with you, I mean, and that was, I think, similar to the way in which they played. And I think if I look at Japan when I was there as the way they have now, I think their game has shifted quite dramatically away from that to more of this open ability, and you've started to get a different flavour in the way in which they play at national level.
Yeah, so as a player, you can be flexible and you can kind of adapt to an environment and pick up bits from different cultures and environments and different team setups. But as a coach, then, whenever you go in as a coach or an ambassador or someone with some sort of management, some sort of input into the philosophy and the culture, how did that transition for you? Did you use your experience of what you valued and what you appreciated as a player? What messages were being delivered to you? That more positive appreciation of what you did well. How did that impact your role as a coach or an ambassador then?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one thing was looking at myself as a player, and then also being in those different teams and seeing how players reacted. Kind of like what try to take the best out of all of those areas and learn from what is it that made players tick, and what actually made players want to train and want to play and feel good about themselves. And so I think I've tried to utilize a lot of that within my coaching. And when I go in there, I look at what coaches are doing and try to look at it from both angles, from what they're trying to coach, but also the way in which the players are reacting. And it's becoming quite apparent that we talk about this player-led culture. And often as a coach, you want that, but you without someone reminding you, you can often start to take too much of the control. And so I work with especially in Asia, where it's very much the culture of not speak up as a player and do what you're told. And so that transition was really interesting, and trying to get the players to be more open and ask more questions and control what they were doing, and with the coach more around that kind of facilitation and allow those players to evolve. And so, in terms of that, it was looking at how to get the best out of players, and how a lot of players don't want to be put in a box. They want to be out of the box and being allowed to express themselves. And certainly something I noticed, when I was in the US, that was a really difference again, because they come from quite a structured sport environment. You've got to look at American football. It's everything is written out, whereas you suddenly get rugby where it's like, well, actually, there's this lot more decision making for every player, and so it was trying to hold the coaches back from from inputting too much and allowing players just to be able to go out onto the field and get used to what rugby was all about. And then, as they add their input. So some of the things I feel like I try to pick on when I am coaching, especially in these developing areas.
Yeah, and then did you find that potentially you might unlock a certain level of creativity from a player whenever there's less structure and it's less of a strict environment? When you move away from that, you can empower guys, and I would imagine you can potentially unlock something that you didn't expect, maybe in a couple of individuals.
Definitely so. Yeah, you suddenly start to see this. I think there's a confidence level rise, and they start to take more control around what they are doing as an individual and then as a team. And, Singapore of late was a really good example in terms of the way in which they, as a group, they started to operate, and the dynamics they started to operate very differently. And it suddenly became a much better communication pathway between player and coach, because often it'd been just one way for a long time. Whereas now there was this go-between that was actually allowing the team to evolve in a lot better space than where it had been before. And I think players were actually starting to see how much it was making a difference to the way in which they approach the game. And it's not just the skill that you bring to it or the decision making. It's the whole approach, and it's what you're doing off the field. Because a lot of the time, even with high performance, you can put structures in place, but players don't really know why they're doing it. They start to follow, as opposed to when you give them the control and the understanding, it becomes a lot easier for them, I think, to get involved with it and buy into that process that you're trying to add, which is going to support their performance.
So tell us a little bit about the development of rugby in Southeast Asia and your exposure in Singapore, and obviously maybe by contrast, because people talk about the potential of the USA Rugby, the sleeping giant. Is there any kind of similar potential in Southeast Asia with their opportunity to kind of develop as a rugby playing nation?
I think so. Across the board, I think the US is an obvious one because they've got a lot of transitional athletes. It was just a matter of time, really, as it starts to grow into more of a game that they've started playing from a younger age, and they catch up in terms of that training age. But in Asia, there's actually been this kind of, I never realised how much kind of history there was in rugby. I went to Sri Lanka for the first time, and there was like 100 years of rugby history there, which you'd never have thought of, because I would think Sri Lanka, I think cricket, which most people would, but the traditions were more so in the rugby environment, and the skill sets and the skill levels, a lot of throughout Asia are actually really impressive. I think it's probably because of some of the crossover sports that they've been more used to, or been presented with at an earlier age. Your cricket, your football, etc. I think one thing that there is in certain areas of Asia, the size probably does matter, but I think that's where Sevens can cross that bridge to start with and allow them to adapt there and progress. And then as they do, they can build out their 15s game. And I worked actually for 18 months in China with their national program, and they're similar to America. They've got athletes in abundance. It's about actually giving them the time to learn the game, and that was where Sevens again helped. And I think the women have now qualified for the Olympics, which is fantastic. But that exposure and people seeing the game will bring more people to the fore, and they do have that opportunity to create some really quality sides there. And I do think in terms of one of the developing areas, it's as a sleeping giant as much as it is the US from what I've seen. It is just that time to develop those athletes and get that kind of flow of athletes and transition coming through,
and getting support from the top as well. If there's that much potential, with obviously the USA is the obvious one, but everywhere else in the world, and obviously the documentary on Pacific rugby, and just the potential there, if they can get support. And obviously it's a massive shame if the politics behind the scenes impinge on the potential there, but we'll not get into that because we could be here all day. But so through all of your experiences, Is there any particular standout person or influence on you that's kind of characterized how you approach the game or how you approach your role as a coach?
Yeah, definitely. So I think in my early days and when I was playing, someone that left a big impression on me was Joe Lydon, um, and where he'd come from in terms of the rugby league world at that time, which had obviously been very, very, very professional, and also, he was coming from a quality club in Wigan at the time, but he brought all of that experience with him, and we were first to kind of taste it, I think, within the England Sevens program at the time. But what I found really humbling at the same time was his ability to work with the players, and it was quite refreshing. And I guess you couldn't say he lacked rugby knowledge, but Sevens wasn't a game he was heavily involved with. But he allowed the players to actually evolve that side of it, whilst he actually worked with the players to really get the best out of them. And so I saw that kind of different coaching, I guess, process, philosophy that he brought that I'd experienced with other coaches. And I really enjoyed that. And as a player, I felt really happy about one in which I was playing, but just comfortable in that environment to be able to, be the best player I could be. And so he impressioned on me a lot. And then latterly, I had Robbie Deans coach in New Zealand, and again, just very different. But I think what I started to get to notice with these guys, it wasn't just their level of rugby understanding and the backgrounds they came from. It was genuinely how well they worked with people. And Robbie was fantastic in that regard. And then from a coaching perspective as well, and coach development perspective, I work quite closely with a guy called Rick Shuttleworth. And what was interesting there, he is a coach, but he works quite a lot in skill acquisition. And so learning the coaching and understanding what he was talking about, it kind of backed up some of my philosophy around coaching and the way I'd like to coach the game. And that was nice to see, because it is slightly different, I think, to what we would necessarily say is the traditional way of coaching. And so for me, it supported my way of thinking, and I've used that now throughout my coaching.
Okay, great stuff, Ben. Let's get into game week, is where we like to kind of focus, and the slight shift of emphasis whenever it's coming up to the most important day of the week, which is game day, obviously. So as a coach in the run up to that, what's your key focuses in coming up to the match? Do you shift slightly away from detail and maybe just slightly move towards a more emotional emphasis? And how does that differ between sevens and 15s?
Yeah, good question. I think the way I would approach the game week is that I think that when not the focus is ever on the team, but it is on that aspect of the players and where they're at. And I think the input from them is really important, because as a coach, we could be feeling a certain way, but unless you have that awareness of actually how your team are playing and your individuals are feeling, if they don't marry up, then you could be actually pushing in the wrong area. And so I think it's really important that you do have that awareness to state and understand that, so that you can position the team exactly where they want to be within what you're looking for. And so, because yes, you can go over a game plan, you can kind of put the icing on the cake in training and stuff, but really knowing where they are at and that they're ready for it, that their mind is on the game and that they're ready to perform, I think is really important. And I think that obviously the difference between 7 and 15s is in sevens, you've got a different balance, because you've got 6 games over a whole weekend. And so there's a different flow to your preparation.
You can't you can't maintain that emotional high like
no,
at 6
exactly.
different points in the weekend.
You've got to have that time in the week where you do just take time out and step away, because it builds and builds. But then during the course of the weekend, you play your game, and then you've got to take that complete time out as well and just switch off, recover quickly, and then switch back on, because if you're constantly up, it just drains you too much. And I think that's probably the difference between the other side with the 15s game. You've got that ability to pray, and then you know that it's an 80-minute battle, and then you can switch off again afterwards. So it's a different preparation method. But in terms of how the players I would react with the players and interact with the players is fairly similar in terms of, if I know that they're comfortable, I think you can design the training around that. You don't need to push things too much. And I think as coaches often, it can be very easy to overtrain in certain areas, and getting that balance is really key.
Yeah, the other balance that it's important to hit is I suppose the level of trust that you impart in the players. And do you micromanage? Do you try and make sure that you, almost as a disclaimer as a coach, you make sure I've done that, I've done my bit, now it's over to you? Or do you trust them? And obviously it depends on the group, but also it depends on the environment. Again, probably a contrast maybe between 7s and 15s, or maybe a contrast depending on how well you know the guys. How does that sit with you, and how do you make sure you get the right balance there?
Yeah, look, I think in the 15s, obviously you've got a bigger operational kind of management as well that can provide you from a head coach's perspective with that input, and they would be able to flag up any player that may not be where they need to be. With the 7s, it's a very close-knit environment, and you kind of live, eat, sleep and breathe together with each other quite a bit. So and I think you can actually translate this into 15s, but having just those, it's not micromanaging, but having those kind of small conversations that are not necessarily planned, if that makes sense, but you just bump into a player and just have a nice conversation. I think the player feels relaxed. You get an honest opinion, and you can obviously get an honest visual back as the coach. So I think those are quite nice. And within that, you often with the 7s, you just check in early in the week in terms of where they're at. Players have got their focus, what they kind of want to focus on for this tournament as an individual. And then, the trust comes in terms of allowing them to follow their preparation and how they prepare for the game. Because as a player, that's one of the things I think you progress through your career, and you do have slight subtle changes in it. As you get more experience, you probably get a little bit more relaxed, but it's a relaxed turn where you are switched on, as opposed to when you're younger and a bit more inexperienced, you're kind of a bit more revved all the time and go. So managing that as the coach, I think, is important. And with the 15s, I think it's similar, but I would lean a lot on my support staff as well in that regard.
Well, that was going to be my next question. How do you make sure everybody that's communicating and contributing to that culture and that environment and that buzz and just the feeling on game day, how do you make sure everybody's on the same page and everybody's presenting the same sort of stuff and have the same emphasis?
I think you've touched on it at one point, which is that level of trust. But I think it's also, in order to gain that level of trust, it's actually delegation, but it's empowering people to do the roles that they're meant to be doing, and not trying to step on them or run over them. But actually, if you have that working relationship where they're trusting you and you're trusting them, and they feel empowered and confident to deliver what they're meant to be delivering, I think that really supports that dynamic where you're all on the same page. And then come game day, you're not having to maybe say, is this been done or has this been done? You've got that level where you know it's being done. And if it hasn't, somebody's probably picked up on it and it's not a problem. And from a support staff, you're all about the players. But as a team, you've got that, I think, common purpose around where you want to go and what you want to achieve in that weekend. And therefore, with that, you build on that, and that's part of that whole cultural piece that you're utilising as well.
Yeah, great stuff. Okay, so Ben, listen, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your philosophies and thoughts and insights into high performance. With COVID at the minute, it's a weird world we're living in. The upside to COVID is no one's playing any 7s, so your world record is going to remain intact for a little bit longer than it might have. Do you see anybody beating that 2,652 points? That'll stay for a while, will it?
Yeah, you never know. Some players who are maybe coming towards the end, the positive for them is COVID may have given them a couple more years in the tank, so we'll see. But I think South Africa is probably the closest to it at the moment. But
What's he sitting on at the minute?
gosh, I wouldn't know. I just know he's been quite a prolific point scorer.
You're a better man than I, because whenever lads were chasing down my appearances for Ulster, I looked it up every week just to make sure, just to find out how close they were. And at one stage, Darren Cave drew level, and I was tweeting Luke Marshall to try and get him fit. Just please get yourself fit here to avoid Darren Cave drawing getting any closer than he already is. So fair play to you.
I think my biggest threat was Tomasi Tharma from New Zealand, who being that kind of island nature, you think could have kept playing. And I think for a while there, I thought this could be the one that actually really pushes to the wire. But fortunately for me, he retired at a good time and about 600 short. But those points rack up quickly if a couple of seasons, and you never know. So, but it's certainly, I think it's a target for someone to grasp hold of.
Yeah, and do you miss it, Ben? Do you miss the being in that, being a player, being in those occasions, and just the crack, the stuff off the pitch, but even just the buzz on the pitch and winning, all that sort of stuff? Do you miss that?
Massively, yeah. I think it's very different from when you're involved in from a coach perspective, and so from my playing days, I do. I really miss that kind of team flavour and the ability to go and perform. It's something, yes, it's nice to get those crowd reactions and that kind of buzz, but just the ability to go out there and run around with a group of guys and have those kind of skill sets put to the test is something I miss a lot.
Yeah, well, I saw you playing for the Veterans 10 side in Dubai just over a year ago, and it looks like you've still got it, so you could probably pick it up at any stage. By contrast, the team that I was playing for, we were struggling for performances. We didn't get any wins. So, Ben, listen, thanks so much for coming on. Really good to catch up with you, and great to hear some of your thoughts on high performance.
Perfect. Thank you for having me on. It's been really enjoyable.
Cheers, Ben. Thanks a lot.
Cheers, guys. Take it easy.